At 11:30 p.m. on the eve of Easter Sunday, a fortress designed to protect millions fell silent. No alarms drew urgency. No gunshots shattered the night. No one ran. Instead, 6 figures moved with patience through concrete, steel, and systems built to never fail. By sunrise, $30 million were gone. Not stolen in chaos but removed with precision. This is not the story of a robbery. It is the story of how absolute security became an illusion, and how the perfect crime began long before the money disappeared. Los Angeles is a city of contradictions. By day, it reveals sunlight, prosperity, and broad avenues stretching like promises of the American dream. But when night falls, the city runs on invisible mechanisms: cash, financial flows, unnamed vaults, and security systems designed to never appear on any tourist map. It was within this silent infrastructure, in late March of 2024, that one of the largest cash fortresses in the United States was breached without a single gunshot, without a single scream, and with almost no visible trace of chaos. The Garda World Cash Services warehouse, in the industrial district of Silmer, north of Los Angeles, is not a building that draws attention. It does not project authority like a central bank, nor does it possess iconic architecture. Yet behind thick concrete walls, beyond razor wire fencing and multi-layer electronic surveillance, lay tens of millions of dollars in cash belonging to businesses, retail chains, casinos, and financial institutions across Southern California. It was a critical node in the monetary circulation of a metropolis of nearly 10 million people. At 11:30 p.m. on March 30, 2024, while most of the city slept through the Easter weekend, the facility was operating in what security engineers describe as a state of total lockdown. Cameras rotated in pre-programmed arcs. Motion sensors swept empty corridors. Invisible infrared beams formed a dense web, designed not to stop reckless intruders, but to render any attempt at intrusion meaningless before it could even begin. Inside the cash vault, pallets of currency were stacked in rows, wrapped in industrial plastic, categorized by denomination, client, and transport route. Here, money was no longer an abstract concept, but a heavy physical presence occupying space, pressing weight into the floor. $30 million, laid side by side, did not evoke luxury. It evoked responsibility, control, and a system convinced it had eliminated human error from risk. That confidence began to fracture when the alarm sounded, ripping through the stillness of Saturday night. At the LAPD dispatch center, it did not trigger panic. This warehouse had generated false alarms before technical glitches, routine malfunctions, incidents that never became real crimes. In a city as vast as Los Angeles, where police resources are constantly stretched across far more urgent emergencies, locations known for crying wolf gradually sink to the bottom of the priority list. At the same moment, from a higher vantage point on the rooftop of a nearby building, 6 figures, dressed in black, observed a completely different reality. Through military-grade night vision equipment, the warehouse appeared as a glowing green map, every detail sharp, every weakness exposed. This was not their first time here. For months, they had studied the structure the way a surgeon studies the human body, every camera angle, every blind spot, every sweep pattern of the sensors. To them, the building was no longer a fortress. It was a problem to be solved. The group did not move with the haste typical of thieves. Every action followed a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a ritual rehearsed until it became instinct. When the leader issued the final command, it was not an act of recklessness, it was confirmation that every variable had been accounted for. Time, light, human response, and most importantly, the complacency of a system long unchallenged. The breach began in the early hours of Easter Sunday, a moment historical data shows patrol activity to be at its lowest. From the roof, an industrial plasma cutting device was activated. Blue-white fire tore through steel and concrete with millimeter precision. This was not a tool easily accessible to ordinary criminals, nor was it one used for spectacle. The objective was silence. When the roof section was cut free and lowered onto pre-positioned padding, no vibration sensor was triggered. In that instant, the boundary between absolute security and the illusion of safety was irreversibly crossed. One by one, 6 figures descended into the interior space, carrying the calm assurance of those executing a plan exactly as designed. Below them stretched a vast warehouse, where cash was arranged with near religious order. Under night vision optics, the space resembled a modern cathedral wealth, worshipped not through ritual, but through procedure and coded systems. For the intruders, this was not their first encounter with large sums of money. But rarely had it been so concentrated. Within such a confined space, and protected by the belief that no one could breach it. They moved between the stacks as if navigating a familiar maze. Motion detectors swept the air. Infrared beams crossed the aisles. Yet everything followed patterns the team had memorized in advance. When they needed to stop, they stopped. When they needed to move, they advanced precisely the calculated distance. There was no improvisation. There were no mistakes. Meanwhile, not far away, a police patrol car cruised down a quiet industrial road. 2 officers talked about holiday family meals, about a city at peace in the night. They had no idea that directly above their line of sight, one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history was being written in silence. When the vault door finally stood before the intruders, it was more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol of absolute faith in technology. 3 feet of reinforced steel. 17 independent locking mechanisms. Electronic systems, biometric controls, and layered redundancies. A design built on the assumption that attackers would always be one step behind the defenders. That assumption was about to be tested. The vault door stood before them as the system's final challenge. 3 feet of reinforced steel were designed, not only to withstand force, but to withstand time, the time it would take for any intruder to give up, before reaching the deepest layer of protection. 17 independent locking mechanisms operated simultaneously, each engineered to assume that if one layer failed, the others would preserve the integrity of the whole. In the minds of the security engineers, redundancy was the ultimate safeguard. But in practice, redundancy can also become a map for those patient enough to learn how to move around it. The man responsible for accessing the control panel showed none of the tension one might expect. To him, the door was not an obstacle, but a system to be negotiated with. Connection ports were opened. Interface cables were attached. And in that moment, the vault symbol of impenetrability was forced to respond to an intelligence it had never been designed to recognize. Lines of code began to run, quietly, without drama, like a delicate surgical procedure unfolding in the dark. The vault's electronic security was built on a layered philosophy: encryption, authentication, cross-checking, and finally mechanical locking systems. Each layer was meant to buy time for human response. But in the early hours of Easter Sunday, human response was almost entirely absent from the equation. The algorithms deployed were not designed to destroy the system, but to convince it that everything happening was authorized. The first layer collapsed without triggering an alert. The second shifted into backup mode, only to be bypassed moments later. One layer after another, the complexity of the security architecture turned against itself. When the final mechanism disengaged, the sound was not metal grinding against metal, but a soft electronic tone almost symbolic. The massive door swung open slowly, not because of its weight, but because of the caution of the men standing on the other side. Inside was a sealed space where cash was stacked from floor to ceiling, orderly to the point of abstraction. Under night vision, the money glowed cold and colorless, stripped of emotion. $30 million does not shine. It waits. For a brief moment, even those who had prepared themselves for this sight fell silent. Concentrated in one place, that much money does not feel luxurious. It feels dangerous. It reminds you that control is temporary, and that one mistake can erase everything. The next command came quickly, without sentiment. Time had become the enemy. The team had not come to admire the prize. They had come to convert it into weight into units that could be moved. A human conveyor belt formed, operating with the rhythm of a factory at night. Bundles passed from hand to hand, loaded into military-grade backpacks, and wheeled carts engineered to handle extreme weight, without sound. There was no argument, no hesitation. Every motion reflected months, perhaps years of preparation. Outside, the Los Angeles police system continued to operate according to the logic of a quiet night. Another alarm was logged. Then another. To dispatchers, they were data points repeating a familiar pattern. Industrial sites with a history of false alerts were rarely urgent when resources were needed elsewhere. When patrol units were finally dispatched, fatigue and routine shaped their perception of what they were about to find. They walked the fence line. Flashlights traced concrete walls, no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no shattered glass. The report "no irregularities observed" was sent back to dispatch. By procedure, the incident was closed. But procedure had never been designed to confront criminals who understood it this well. Inside, the intruders froze, listening to footsteps outside, doors opening and closing, fragments of conversation drifting through the structure. For 90 seconds, success hung by a thread. One closer look, one altered decision, and the plan would have collapsed. When the patrol cars finally pulled away, the tension released not into celebration, but into focus. The work resumed at a faster pace. 600 pounds of cash were distributed evenly. No one carried more than planned. The division was not a matter of ethics, but of survival. A flawless operation required balance. Inequality was a seed of betrayal. Their exit was not the way they had entered. A breach in a side wall, concealed behind industrial air conditioning units' visual noise, no one ever questioned, became the final passage. One by one, they slipped through the opening. Above them, the sky over Los Angeles began to lighten. 3 vehicles departed in different directions. No freeways. No routes favored by license plate recognition systems. Only surface streets winding through sleeping neighborhoods, paths known only to those who had studied the city like a maze. By sunrise, the 6 individuals and $30 million had dissolved into a city of 8 million people. On Monday morning, April 1st, the first employee arrived at the warehouse with her usual routine and a cup of coffee. Nothing seemed wrong at first. Then she noticed the vault. The door was open. Inside, the space was empty. Every pallet gone. Plastic wrapping scattered across the floor like confetti. In that moment, the crime ceased to be invisible. What had been a silent operation became a federal case. Within minutes, the facility was sealed. Investigators arrived. And the question that would define the next phase of the story emerged with unsettling clarity. How does a system designed to never fail collapse so completely? Once the scene was sealed, the central question was no longer who had taken the money, but how a system designed to be untouchable had failed so completely. Federal investigators entered the warehouse with a mindset different from that of ordinary theft cases. There was no chaos here. No haste. No careless mistakes. Every detail from the cut in the roof to the way the vault had been opened suggested deep familiarity, not only with technology, but with the people who operated it. The first hours of the investigation focused on physical space. The opening in the roof was measured carefully. Its dimensions were neither excessive nor improvised. It avoided load-bearing beams, bypassed vibration sensors, and was placed where security engineers had assumed intensive monitoring was unnecessary. Such precision was not the result of guesswork. It implied access to blueprints, or at the very least, intimate knowledge of the building's structure. The sidewall exit showed the same intent, no reckless damage, no obvious disruption. It was concealed behind industrial equipment employees saw every day and therefore no longer questioned. Inside the vault, what struck investigators most was not the emptiness, but how empty it was. There were no signs of forced entry. No pried locks. No damaged mechanisms. The electronic systems had not been destroyed. They had simply been persuaded to open. For those who had examined countless failed break-ins, the implication was immediate and unsettling. The intruders had not fought the system, they had spoken to it, in its own language. It was at this point that the phrase "inside job" began circulating in closed-door conversations. Not as a conclusion, but as an unavoidable hypothesis. To execute a breach of this scale, the perpetrators needed more than tools and courage. They needed schedules. They needed to understand human response patterns. They needed to know which alarms were routinely dismissed, which hours drew the least scrutiny, and which procedures existed more on paper than in practice. The investigation quickly expanded from the building to the people. Hundreds of current and former employees were interviewed. The earliest questions were deceptively simple. Work shifts, responsibilities, prior alarms. But as investigators pressed deeper, a more troubling picture emerged. Over the years, the company had struggled with internal discrepancies, cash shortages, accounting irregularities, and management decisions aimed at keeping operations running, rather than exposing vulnerabilities. Some employees described being instructed to bypass procedures, considered mandatory. Emergency cash transfers to cover temporary shortages. Reports adjusted to avoid triggering audits. Not everyone viewed these actions as wrongdoing. In an environment where handling cash was routine, the line between flexibility and violation blurred dangerously. And within that blur, the conditions for a far larger plan began to take shape. Investigators also recognized another critical factor. The knowledge required to neutralize the security system could not have been acquired from the outside alone. Sensor sweep timings, alert prioritization, and dispatch response behavior were details that only became visible through prolonged exposure to the system. It did not require a single mastermind on the inside. A chain of small disclosures, intentional or careless over time, could provide a complete operational map. Digital forensic analysis added another layer of concern. Analysts detected controlled communication gaps around the warehouse during the night of the heist. Not total silence, but deliberate interference. Wi-Fi disruptions brief enough to delay secondary alerts. Localized cellular degradation that created a temporary bubble of quiet within a city that rarely sleeps. These signals pointed to military-grade jamming equipment technology, almost never associated with conventional theft. At the same time, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from surrounding areas. Black SUVs appeared and vanished at precise blind spots, at moments of minimal traffic. There were no reckless maneuvers, no standout license plates. Everything was calibrated to remain unremarkable. Such movement required more than driving skill. It required an understanding of how the city watches itself. Within law enforcement, an unspoken debate emerged. Some believed the heist represented a rare convergence of advanced technology and organized crime. Others argued that without internal knowledge, such precision would have been impossible. History offered little comfort. The most devastating security failures in American criminal history rarely occurred when systems were weak, but when they were confident. Interviews stretched into hours, then days. Polygraph examinations were used not as definitive proof, but as psychological pressure. Some employees appeared unusually anxious. Others unnervingly calm. Yet no confession surfaced. $30 million was a powerful incentive for silence powerful enough to outweigh loyalty, fear, and conscience alike. As weeks passed without a breakthrough, the investigation shifted again. The focus moved away from identifying who took the money, toward understanding the system that had allowed it to be taken. Who designed these protocols? Who approved the incremental changes that softened them? And how many of those decisions were driven not by security, but by convenience and profit? Answers did not arrive all at once. But gradually, through old audit reports, testimonies from former employees, and overlooked internal records, a difficult truth emerged. This crime was not merely an external intrusion. It was the outcome of years of accumulated decisions, risks accepted, procedures diluted, and vigilance replaced by routine. Once the physical evidence had been cataloged, and the theory of an inside job began to solidify, the investigation was forced in a direction. Every major financial crime eventually must take not to where the money was taken from, but to where it would reappear. Because cash, no matter how quietly it is stolen, cannot vanish forever. It must be spent, transformed, or hidden. And it is in that process that human behavior most often betrays itself. $30 million in cash is a physical burden before it becomes a legal one. It occupies space. It carries the distinct smell of paper and ink. And above all, it attracts attention. Investigators understood that the perpetrators could not simply take the money home and hide it under floorboards. Every decision after the theft carried risk, and the more money involved, the greater that risk became. The days immediately following the discovery of the heist were the most dangerous for anyone involved. The city was hot. Patrols increased. Financial institutions were alerted. Large cash movements were subjected to heightened scrutiny. Under those conditions, the most rational strategy was not action, but restraint. The money went dormant, divided, immobilized, and concealed across multiple locations. Safe houses. Short-term storage rentals. Unremarkable spaces in a city where temporary storage of personal property is routine and rarely questioned. As time passed and media attention faded, the more difficult phase began, turning illicit cash into assets that could survive within the legitimate financial system. Specialists at the FBI often describe this stage as a marathon of patience. There are no shortcuts. Every step must be calibrated to avoid triggering mandatory reporting thresholds, bank scrutiny, or behavioral anomalies. A portion of the money was believed to have entered mid-level real estate transactions. Modest homes, small commercial properties, and industrial units purchased through intermediary entities, sometimes in the names of individuals with no visible connection to the crime. Real estate has long been a preferred vehicle for laundering money. Not because it is discreet, but because it can absorb large sums in a single transaction. A property can be bought in cash, renovated, and later sold as a legitimate investment, slowly erasing the origin of the funds. Other portions followed more intricate paths. Cash-intensive businesses with hard-to-verify margins, restaurants, car washes, entertainment venues became logical destinations. In such environments, cash is expected. Blending small amounts of illicit money into daily revenue can continue for months without creating obvious discrepancies. No transaction is large. No movement is abrupt. Just the gradual erosion of the boundary between legal and illegal income. Investigators also monitored less traditional channels. Precious metals, high-end watches, artworks, portable assets that are easy to move but difficult to price precisely. These commodities can cross borders without reliance on the traditional banking system, adding another layer of insulation. In some cases, cash was converted into cryptocurrency through informal intermediaries, exploiting regulatory gaps and inconsistent oversight. Yet every pathway leaves traces. Not direct traces of money, but traces of lifestyle. A vehicle that does not align with reported income. An unexpected investment. A subtle shift in spending habits. Financial behavior analysts understand that criminals are rarely caught by their first transaction, but by patterns that accumulate over time. The same patience that enabled the perpetrators to execute a flawless heist would be required indefinitely to remain free. As a result, the investigation became quieter and more prolonged. Thousands of financial records were examined. Networks of individuals, shell companies, and intermediary entities were mapped. Interviews continued, no longer centered on the warehouse, but on personal histories. Who had financial pressure, who carried resentment, who had reason to feel excluded or exploited. Often, the most revealing leads did not come from hard evidence, but from inconsistencies in human stories. On the other side of the operation, the reality of living with the money set in. $30 million promised power, but demanded discipline. Every purchase, every relationship, every movement became a calculation. The freedom the money represented was constrained by the very secrecy required to protect it. Time did not cool the case. It complicated it. Each month without resolution reinforced two parallel possibilities. Either this was one of the most sophisticated laundering operations ever attempted, or it was only a matter of time before the weakest link surfaced. History suggests that large conspiracies rarely hold forever. Money alters people. It magnifies ambition, fear, and betrayal. As the first weeks passed without any arrests, the investigation entered what federal agents often call the long game. There were no longer crime scene tapes or patrol cars filling the headlines. Instead, there was a deliberate quiet. In cases like this, silence is not a sign of failure, it is a prerequisite for time to do its work. Inside closed offices, investigators began reconstructing the heist not as a sequence of actions, but as an ecosystem of decisions. Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Who had capability? These three elements rarely converge in a single individual. More often, they are distributed overlapping at just enough points to create catastrophe. The investigative map was no longer the layout of a warehouse, but a network of people, current employees, former staff, subcontractors, security technicians, and names that had appeared briefly in records years earlier before fading into obscurity. Particular attention was given to individuals who had exited the system under strained disciplinary disputes. Financial pressure, unresolved resentment. History shows that insiders rarely come from those who feel secure. They emerge from the margins, from people who believe the system profited from them without reciprocation. Over time, such beliefs can harden into justification. At the same time, analysts began tracking subtle shifts in the city's financial rhythms. Not large transactions, but quiet ones. A newly formed company with unclear capitalization. A property purchased quickly and renovated aggressively. A person whose travel between states suddenly became frequent. Each detail alone could be benign. Together, they formed patterns that demanded closer scrutiny. This hunt produced no gunfire, no high-speed chases. It unfolded in conference rooms, spreadsheets, and interviews that stretched so long participants lost track of time. Investigators understood that pressure did not need to come from confrontation. It came from repetition, from returning to the same questions at different angles, until inconsistencies surfaced on their own. Coordination between federal investigators and local law enforcement grew more refined. Local officers provided insight into neighborhoods and daily rhythms that national databases could not capture. Federal teams supplied analytical depth and access to financial intelligence beyond municipal reach. The partnership was not seamless, but in cases of this magnitude, it was indispensable. Time continued to pass. Media attention drifted elsewhere. To the public, the heist became an unsolved mystery, fading into the background noise of a restless news cycle. But for investigators, each quiet day was a test of patience. They knew history rarely favors those who believe they have escaped consequence entirely. The strain of secrecy, of living parallel lives, of constantly censoring one's own behavior, erodes even the most disciplined individuals. In closed meetings, a familiar principle was repeated: there is no perfect crime, only crimes that have not had enough time. The confidence displayed during the heist now faced a different adversary: the slow, relentless persistence of institutional pursuit. Unloud, unshowy, unyielding. On the other side, those who had taken the money learned how heavy waiting could become. Each unrelated arrest made headlines. Each unfamiliar phone number triggered anxiety. Each casual encounter carried the possibility of exposure. Wealth offered comfort, but not certainty. And while they tried to blend back into ordinary routines, the silent hunt continued methodically, patiently, one file at a time. The investigation was no longer about identifying who took the money. It had become a question of who would make the first mistake. Because in crimes like this, the decisive moment rarely comes from bold action. It comes from a small lapse, a careless word, a rushed decision, or a moment when silence finally becomes too costly to maintain. Time, in major investigations, rarely takes sides. It does not act as a fair judge, nor as a ruthless executioner. It simply does its work quietly, eroding memory, discipline, and the vows of silence once believed to be unbreakable. As the first month passed without a clear turning point, both sides of the story began to feel pressure, though in very different ways. For federal investigators, the pressure came from responsibility. A $30 million theft could not be allowed to fade into obscurity. Every briefing with superiors returned to the same questions: where is the progress? Where are the leads? Is the case advancing, or slipping towards stagnation? Those seasoned in long-form investigations understood that the absence of immediate results did not signal failure. It meant the case was unfolding according to its nature: slow, complex, and dependent on human error rather than technological perfection. On the other side, those who had taken the money were forced to learn how to live in a nameless state. The adrenaline of the operation had vanished. The sense of triumph faded quickly. In its place came days defined by calculation. Should a birthday celebration be larger than usual? Should a vacation be postponed? Should an investment be placed under someone else's name? Every decision carried the fear that even a minor deviation could attract unwanted attention. Time also began to expose differences within the group itself. Iron discipline can be sustained during moments of extreme tension, but it rarely survives the routines of everyday life. Some adapted easily, slipping back into normal rhythms as if nothing had happened. Others became haunted by details: the sound of the locks disengaging, the green glow of night vision optics, the frozen moment when police vehicles stopped outside. These obsessions, if left unchecked, had the potential to drive impulsive choices. From the investigative side, patience evolved into strategy. Agents stopped searching for a single dramatic breakthrough. Instead, they began assembling parallel narratives, small stories that might not yet be legally actionable, but together formed a growing picture. A former security employee transitioned into private consulting. Another individual suddenly resolved long-standing debt. Alone, these facts meant little. Together, they raised uncomfortable questions. Coordination with local law enforcement became quieter, more deliberate. Rather than visible raids or public actions, officers contributed local knowledge: changes in neighborhood patterns, unusual business activity, subtle shifts that raw data could not explain. A new shop opening with revenue that exceeded its apparent scale. A warehouse leased long-term without clear operational use. These observations were recorded, not acted upon, waiting for the right moment. Time also reshaped the media narrative. Initial headlines gave way to brief mentions, then silence. To the public, the lack of updates suggested a stalled investigation. For investigators, it was ideal. As public scrutiny faded, abnormal behavior became easier to spot, no longer hidden by the noise of constant attention. Interviews changed in tone as well. No longer confrontational, no longer urgent. They became conversational, exploratory, sometimes appearing irrelevant. The goal was not to extract confessions, but to let contradictions surface naturally over repeated encounters. Time, once again, served as a quiet ally. For those holding the money, waiting grew heavier by the day. Comfort could be purchased, but peace of mind could not. Every report of an unrelated arrest sparked unease. Every rumor of questioning reignited anxiety. In moments of weakness, small mistakes, a careless remark, a rushed choice became increasingly likely. Time did not favor either side. It applied pressure evenly. For investigators, the burden was to prove that institutions could still pursue crimes of extraordinary sophistication. For the perpetrators, it was the challenge of living ordinary lives, while carrying a secret large enough to destroy everything. And within that fragile balance, the story edged closer to its decisive moments, where a single misstep could alter the fate of an entire conspiracy. There is rarely a dramatic moment that signals the collapse of a meticulously planned operation. No sirens. No handcuffs closing under flashing lights. Instead, cases like this begin to fracture through details, so small they are almost invisible. A tired individual. A changed routine. A decision that seems reasonable in isolation, but becomes discordant when viewed in the larger pattern. And at this stage, time, the factor that once favored the perpetrators, begins to shift its allegiance. The first cracks rarely appear in financial records. They emerge in daily life. Investigators noticed a familiar pattern. After months of restraint, some individuals began to reward themselves. Not through extravagance, but through subtle upgrades: a quieter apartment, a newer car that did not seem excessive, short trips disguised as work. Each action alone was defensible. Together, they formed a curve that no longer aligned with declared income. During subsequent interviews, voice and body language became as valuable as spoken words. Investigators observed changes in how certain individuals told their stories. Minor details drifted out of sequence. Timelines blurred. Gaps were filled with vague explanations. Defensive posture appeared where none had existed before. No one confessed. But no one told their story the same way twice. Digital analysis also began to yield late but meaningful signals. Devices that had remained silent during the night of the heist reappeared elsewhere in the data stream, not as direct evidence, but as behavioral shadows. A concealed IP address surfaced during an unguarded login. Equipment purchased through intermediaries appeared again in unrelated transaction chains. There was no single decisive strike, only grains of sand, accumulating within the machinery of the investigation. Coordination between federal investigators and local law enforcement entered a more refined phase. Rather than pushing for immediate charges, pressure was applied selectively. An administrative inquiry. A casual contact. A reminder that the case remained open. The objective was not to intimidate, but to observe reaction. Because reaction, when unexpected, often reveals more than rehearsed answers. On the other side, that pressure produced uneven effects. Some individuals withdrew further into silence, shrinking their social circles to the point of isolation. Others did the opposite, seeking reassurance through conversation, explaining more than necessary. It was in these divergences that weaknesses emerged. A plan perfected on paper had never been designed to withstand the prolonged strain of human psychology. Any internal communication that once existed became shorter, more guarded, and eventually sparse. Trust, once tested by time and fear, proved difficult to sustain. Each person began calculating privately how much was enough to remain silent, how much was enough to walk away, and where loyalty ended and self-preservation began. History shows that the most dangerous phase of a conspiracy is not when the money is taken, but when it is safely hidden, because that is when collective purpose gives way to individual survival. For investigators, these fractures were not an endpoint, but a signal. It was still too early for overt action. A premature move could collapse fragile lines of evidence. Instead, observation continued, allowing contradictions to grow under the weight of time. And so, in a city where millions of stories unfold every day, the heist faded from public memory. But beneath the calm surface, the cracks widened. Not because of technology, not because of luck, but because human beings, limited, fallible, and exhausted, cannot carry a secret of this magnitude forever without leaving a trace. In every long-running investigation, there comes a moment when waiting ceases to be a strategy and becomes the final test. In the case of the $30 million heist, that moment did not arrive in a single night. It formed gradually, like pressure building inside a sealed chamber. No one could name the exact day it began, but everyone involved sensed the shift. Events were moving toward a point of no return. For federal investigators, the decision point was not about whether they had enough evidence to make arrests, but about how to use what they now knew. After months of surveillance, analysis, and interviews, the overall picture had sharpened, but dangerous gaps remained. Acting too soon could send remaining links underground. Waiting too long risked allowing evidence to cool, memories to fade, and financial trails to dissolve. The decision was no longer purely legal. It was strategic, psychological, and irreversible. Attention turned toward those believed to be standing on the most fragile ground between silence and action. Not the smartest, not the greediest, but the most exhausted. History shows that in complex crimes, the first person to break is rarely the mastermind. It is the one who feels they are carrying more risk than reward, or who senses the system closing in without offering protection. Carefully orchestrated encounters began to occur. Not threats, reminders. A casual remark that the case remained active. A look held just long enough to communicate that no one had been forgotten. Investigators offered no explicit promises and outlined no clear escape. They allowed imagination to do the work instead, knowing that undefined fear is often more powerful than direct warning. On the other side, the shift was unmistakable. There was no concrete sign of imminent arrest, yet everything suggested that the margin of safety was narrowing. Conversations grew tense. Long-term plans were postponed indefinitely. Some individuals began calculating an exit willing to accept partial loss in exchange for stability. Others clung tightly to the belief that if silence had worked this long, it could work forever. It was within this silent division that the decision point truly emerged. Not through a dramatic act, but through a small choice: to call or not to call, to speak or not to speak, to trust or to doubt an unspoken promise. For one individual, the decision may have lasted only seconds, but its consequences carried the weight to define the fate of the entire operation. From the investigative side, patience reached its controlled limit. Contingency plans were finalized. If cooperation came, teams needed to be ready to secure, protect, and act without delay. If no one spoke, the case would continue potentially for years under the growing risk that time and financial evolution would erase what remained. At this stage, the decision no longer belonged to any single person. It was the cumulative result of pressure, fear, and private calculation built over months. A plan engineered to be flawless for one night now faced a test it had never truly accounted for: human endurance. And history has shown, time and again, that this is the most unpredictable variable in any criminal equation.